Hello dear viewers, support me by subscribing to my channel and share my video if you like it, and also make sure you comment your thoughts. The Wolfswood 301 AC. Cregan, he had begged, pleaded, and finally Jay had relented, only to then argue when Robb had done likewise. His cousin had then bid them join him away from the camp, and he, Robb and Dusk and Grey Wind, did just that. They walked for some time, Jay in silence while he and Robb spoke to each other. Both of them were determined to play their part and told each other that they'd not back down should their king suggest it to them. Behind them, his uncle walked and listened, Arthur, just like Jay, staying quiet until they reached the hill that overlooked the Wolfswood itself. Rosenix rested on top of it, and it was to her that Jay went to first. Cregan watching as he spoke to the dragon just how he himself would speak to Dusk and how he'd seen Robb speak to Grey Wind. Their wolves were not pets, not just beasts that walked with them. They were more than that to them all, Jay included. What Rosenix was to him, though, was more again Cregan not truly understanding it, and yet believing those who named her Jay's sister. I didn't wish you to take part in what was to come, not simply out of a sense of worry for you both. Jade said, and it was Robb who interrupted him. You think we don't worry about you, brother? That we don't fear for your safety each time you take to the sky? Robb asked, and Cregan watched as Jay moved to him and placed his hand on his brother's shoulder. Aye, I know you do. But I'm in the air, Robb. Upon a dragon's back, it's the only reason that Arthur lets me leave each day. Jack said, and Cregan turned to see the small smile on his uncle's face and the slight nod of his head. I wish to play my part, brother, as does Cregan. Men have fought, and while we were with them, I feel we've not done as much as we should, Rose said, and he saw Jane sigh. I'd have none of you do what you should for as long as I could make it so, though you're both men, grown, and I'll not stand in your way. Just don't expect me to explain to your wives that it was by your choice that you rode today. Jack said with a smirk on his face. No, cousin, will not, he said as Jay nodded. I'll have your oaths, though, both of you. I'll have your word, or I'll see that you're forcibly taken from here, and to your wives. No jest, I'll see it done, should you not speak the truth, and do as I bid. Jade said, all joviality gone from his voice now. You have it, brother. I swear it on the old gods and the new. Rosier said, clasping Jay by the arm. Aye, me too, cousin. I swear it as well, he said as he did likewise when Robb moved away. Then I can ask no more. Very well. When the birds chirp and the signal is given, you ride, both of you. Ride and ride hard, and you don't bloody stop riding until you're well away from the attack. No matter what happens, you ride and ride hard. Jake said, and he nodded, seeing Robb do likewise. Before he then got a chance to ready his horse, both he and Robb were called to his uncle's tent. Cregan entering to find all three of his uncles present, and Robb looking very sheepish as he took a seat beside his cousin. The look on his uncle's face was as if it had been carved out on a weirwood, Cregan shrinking under the glare as Ned looked at first him and then at Robb. You volunteered? His uncle Ned said, and Robb tried to speak, only for no words to come out. Cregan instead doing the talking for him, or starting to at least. Hey, uncle, we did. Men have ridden and fought for the king. For the North, and we wish to do the same. Not out of a search for honor or glory, but so we can sit and look those men in the eye and not feel as if they'd been asked to do what we were not, he said. Rosier then joining in. I can't do it, father. I can't sit with men who fought when I have not. Aye, I know it's a good thing that we've not been forced to do so, but men from Essos have given their lives for the North, fought for the North, and for Jay. You yourself have done so, and while we fought some at the wall, I wish to play my part too so that I can hold my head up high. Rosier Knives said, his voice growing firmer by the end. Should you have a head to hold up, nephew? Benjen said, though it was Arthur who answered. I've said my piece. Both lads have made their promises to the king. I believe they'll hold true to those promises. Arthur said, and he and Robb looked on as his uncle Ned nodded. Very well, I'll not stop you. I will ask you both to be careful and to take no more risks than are needed. We will, father, Robb said. Hey, uncle, he said as they rose to walk from the tent. I'm proud of you both. We all are, his uncle Ned said. And looking to see both Benjen and Arthur nod, he felt 10 feet tall as they left the tent. It took 2 days to ride to where Geo bid them form up. His cousin joining them each night after he'd spent the day with Rhaenix bringing the fight to the dead. As they'd eat, they'd speak of their wives, Jane of his child and Robb of the hope of his own, something that Jay told him would come in time. Each of them took comfort in the fact that they were far from here. Robb and he were both happy to learn that not only had Oz and Winefried left the north, but they were settled and safe in Seaguard. When the day came, he and the others lined up on the ridge with bows in hand. Cregan looking to men of the north from Sea Dragon Point, Winterfell, and even further afield. The best archers from the Company of the Rose, the West, and the Reach lined up with them, as did men and women of the Free Folk. While his and Robb's skills weren't on a par with theirs, they had their own role to play, and he watched Jake take to the sky. He turned to see dusk and gray wind with the horses and the birds resting in the trees of the Wolfswood behind them. In the distance, they soon saw the flames, and then he heard the birds call out loudly, and the wolves both howled, the first signal coming and making them ready their bows. Knock! The voices shouted out, and he pulled back on the bowstring. He leaned back and aimed his bow to the air. Loose! The arrows flew, and were it not for the ones that were flaming, he'd not have been able to see them in the night sky. As it was, he hadn't even seen who it was he was aiming at, only to see the fires begin to catch as they hit home, and to then wish it was darkness that he looked at once again. Knock. Aim in. Loose. Again the arrows flew, and this time he heard some cheers as a large group of dead fell. Cregan, seeing a man from the Company of the Rose being patted on the back, and then seeing Rhaenys lay down her flames once more, this time a little closer to them. Knock. Aim. Loose. Knock. Aim. Loose. Over and over the call rang out, and he let loose his dragonglass-tipped arrows, the flames showing more and more of the sight in front of him, and he was happy to see them hitting home and dead men falling. When the sounds of the birds screeching came, he looked to Robb and to the others, and wondered if any would not carry out Jock's orders. He heard another cheer as yet more dead fell, and then he and the others were moving towards the horses. In the trees, the birds looked down at him, and he saw that Robb was looking at them too as he took his reins and mounted. Then as one, almost 200 horses turned from the field behind them and began to ride and ride hard as their king had ordered them to. Turning to look behind him, he saw the dead begin to crest the hill and then fade from view, the flames soon covering them as Jax and Rhaenys went about their work, and as more ground was put between the riders and the dead. When his cousin joined them, he looked worn out and was not very talkative, though he did thank each and every one of them before he went to his bed and told them that they were to ride and join the others on the morrow. As for Jack, his own work it seemed wasn't done, as after they broke their fast and began to ride south, his cousin once again climbed onto Rhaenys' back and flew north. Dragonstone 301 AC. Perwyn Fry. Watching his sister get married was something that brought a tear to his eye, even if the man she married wouldn't have been his first choice for her. If he was being honest with himself, then the small John may have been among the last people he'd ever have wished Rosamund to even speak with, let alone lay with. Yet the man himself was very different than he expected a Northman to be, and there was genuine affection and perhaps even this soon love between him and his sister. So much so that since they'd marched from Last Hearth and then been forced to evacuate and go even further, Rosine had missed her husband terribly. Both he and Olvar had done their best to be there for her, but with his sister, just like with the captain of the ship they sailed on, it wasn't in anyone on board's power to make either feel better. Lorraine Targaryen, too, was missing his love, and only a blind man wouldn't be able to see so, given that he spent so much of his time alone on deck as they sailed to Dragonstone. That his love was the princess was something that had at first confused both him and his brother. The idea that a bastard could or would be allowed such a match was not something that either of them understood. Though given the king's own experiences and his nature, perhaps that shouldn't be the case. Yakshiros Targaryen had actually come to his sister's wedding. He'd sang and played his harp and honored Rosalind with both his presence and with a dance. He talked to him and Oliver and asked them how they saw their own futures. Perwyn was surprised both that he took an interest and that he then suggested if he could help in any way, then he would. It had made him consider speaking to him about his mother's granduncle. The man was suffering, and he'd heard so many things about the king and what he was able to do that he wondered if they could help Giles. In the end, he hadn't needed to, as Rosalind took it upon herself to raise the matter and had been told the king would send some of his own healers to Rosave. Yet for all the unexpected things his journey north and then back south had brought him, none were more so than Munda, Perwyn looking at the red-headed girl as she lay beside him in their tent. She'd stolen him, or that's what she called it, and he supposed in a way it was true. His heart was hers, after all. He could only imagine what his father would have thought had he lived still. How he'd have reacted to see Rosian married to a northern savage, and Perwyn finding love with a wilding. No free folk, that's what they were, and how the king of the 8 kingdoms saw them, and who was he to name them anything else? The smile on his face was warm as he watched her sleep, and though he wished he could stay abed all day, he had work to do. "You were going to leave me sleeping?" Munda asked angrily as she woke while he dressed. "You looked so peaceful, I felt it for the best," he said with a chuckle, and then ducked the small stone she threw at him, wondering where she got it from, and then feeling the larger one hit him and noticing it was some pieces of dragon glass that she had thrown at him. "Wear your dagger," she said softly, and he nodded before leaning down to place a kiss on her lips, one she returned most eagerly. Walking from the tent, he looked around at the rows upon rows of them that stretched as far as the eye can see, admittedly not that far, even in the light of the countless torches that burned day and night, or whatever passed for a day in this new world they lived in. He nodded to some of the free folk as he walked, soon finding Torrig sitting by the fire and stopping to speak to his good brother. Munda and he had not been wed in any ceremony of note, but she was his wife and he was her husband all the same. "My sister sleeps still?" Torrig asked, and Perwyn could see the smirk on his face. "She does, she likes her rest," he said, taking the offered piece of bacon from Jaime, and though he didn't take a seat, he did stay to speak to each of those who were sitting there before he then bid them his farewells, and made the long trek to the keep itself. As an anointed knight, he'd been tasked with more and more duties since they'd arrived at the island. While there were many men to help guard and protect all who'd been brought here, most of the knights and lords were elsewhere, and so by default, his own stock had risen. Daenerys had taken a liking to him and to Olivar, even going so far as to name his brother as his squire, only making that even more true. It was something he was very proud of, and given his ties with the free folk, he'd become a liaison of sorts between them and those who held the island in the princess's name. Entering the great hall, he was surprised to find people in a much happier mood. People who'd not been that was. Both Orane and Missandei seemed to almost be floating on air, and it took him speaking to Olivar to find out the reasons why. His brother quickly telling him that they'd received letters from the princess and others, and that Rosie too had received word from her husband. Perwyn smiling broadly at the thoughts of that, as he knew just how much it would please his sister. More so when Olivar said they had written back and the birds had already flown. His day was spent going over the free folks' needs and making sure their stocks were holding. There was no true hunting on Dragonstone, and while they could and did catch fresh fish daily, had the island not been prepared for their arrival, then people would have starved by now. Perwyn was not able to wrap his head around how they'd managed to prepare so well, and though their supplies wouldn't last forever, they did have moons of them to go. Orane asked him to see to more of the men's training, and then told him that he'd be heading to Driftmark in a day or two, and so would need him to take on even more responsibility. Later, he found out that he had a letter of his own from Lord Giles, and just reading the contents of it brought him such relief. His granduncle was feeling so much better and looked forward to seeing him, Olivar and Rosalind once again. Turning down the offer to eat with his brother and sister in the keep, he made his way back to the camp to find Munda among those making their own meals for that night. The file she gave him almost stilling his heart, and he knew then what path his life would take in the future. It would be Olivar and not him that Giles could call on as Roseby's heir. His place was not in the south, and he took comfort in the fact that he'd be near Rosalind and her husband. He, like the rest of the free folk, had no doubt their king would be victorious, and as he sat down, it was to tales of the winter dragon and to the feel of Munda's arm wrapped around his own that he ate his meal. The Wolfswood 301 AC. Jaehaerys Targaryen. The army would reach Winterfell either today or tomorrow, Jay knowing they'd enjoy the rest that was to come, even if it would only last a day or so. His own rest was further away than that, as what Dany had told him, or to be more precise, what Sheed had told the Eagle, had completely changed his plans. He should have guessed the Night King would adapt, that his tactics would change based on his own, and yet, be it hubris or something else, he had not. Jay was happy that his cousins had played their part, and that they'd rode with him on the first ambush, and not on another. Not that there would be another, that way at least. No, he couldn't risk men falling and being raised again, even 200 or 300 of them, given which men he'd have used for his ambush. His best archers, the quickest riders, he'd need those men later, and so it had been back to what he'd been doing before. He and Ringaix, bringing the flames and laying them down on the dead men that walked beneath them, or at least it had until they'd reached the Wolfswood, as from there he'd not been able to. To do so would risk the trees themselves, and while survival was the most important thing, in time people would need to come back and live in the north, and those trees were part of the wealth they'd need to thrive. It left him in a quandary. The Wolfswood would give the dead cover all the way to the Barrowlands if they wished, and he needed them to face him and not to hide from him. So much so that he'd not flown back to the camp, and had instead slept beside Rhaenyx, close to the large forest itself, offering himself up as a target and hoping they'd take the bait, which up to now they had not. What was worst of all, though, was that he couldn't truly see them, couldn't track their movements, and so he was relying on what he believed them to be. That was a dangerous game to be playing when the stakes were so high. "You should sleep," Rhaenys said, and he nodded as he called the eagle to him and went looking for the door. "You too, Rod. I know you worry, given where we are, but you need to rest too. I'll know long before we're in any danger," he said as he stroked his hand close to her eyes, feeling her as she leaned into him. "I will, little brother." Sleep wasn't hard to come by, and for once he didn't go looking through ghost eyes. The longer he'd been away from Marguerite and Alia, the harder it was to not lose himself in the wolf when he opened that particular door. Thoughts of just watching them as they slept would fill his mind, and he knew he was in danger of whiling away the hours doing just that, when he really should rest. How long he'd been asleep before he woke, he knew not. He felt them, though, as they moved towards him, and calling out for Rhaenys, he looked on as she let loose her flames. The Night King had sent a large group towards him, and as he watched them fall, he was surprised to see the White Walkers amongst them. "We should go now, Jay." Rhaegar almost shouted at him, and though a part of him wished to stay and fight, in this she was in the right. With one more letting loose of her flames, he hurriedly climbed onto her back, and then they were in the air. Jax looking back, and as he looked to the trees, he swore he could see the Night King himself. He had come for him, and yet had not sought to face him. Why, he knew he wished him dead. Yet he'd not sought to end this here and now. Why? Was he afraid of him? Did he fear that he'd not be able to beat him? Or was something else going on that he couldn't see? The questions kept coming as they flew away from the Wolfswood. Rhaenys only landing by the stream when he bid her because it was flat ground, and so it made it impossible for them to be snuck up upon. As he washed in the stream and felt the cold water on his face, he pondered on those questions, and the more he did, the more he became certain of one thing. While not scared of him, the Night King was fearful of him. He had doubts, and doubts were something that he should exploit. The only problem was that he wasn't sure how, and even if he found a way, would Rhaenys go along with it. Actually, knowing that it would need to be him and not the dragon that the Night King became even warier of. Walking back to Rhaenys, he knew she'd argue with him, and so he tried to keep it to himself. The inklings of a plan that he had come up with, he tried and failed. "No, I'll not," Rhaen said as he stood in front of him. "I don't even know if it can be done, Rhae, but if it can, then I mustn't I?" he said softly as he stood in front of her. "You risk too much, Jay, far too much," Sister said, her worry beating anger for now. "I don't even know if it can be done, Rhae. I think it can, but I don't know, and I won't until I'm sure," he said to no reply. "I'll have Arthur by my side," he added a moment later. And though it didn't get her to agree, it did at least get her to calm somewhat. The flight to Winterfell took no time at all, and when he arrived, it was to find he was the first. The army was further back on the road, and would take a few more hours before it too reached the keep. It was eerie to say the least, walking through the empty courtyard, and then into the silent keep, Jaime aside, carrying Lightbringer in his hand to illuminate the way. Reaching the great hall, he was glad to see the wood had been laid beside the fires, and so, after lighting some torches and then the fires themselves, he then made his way to the crypts to pay his respects. After speaking to his mother, uncle, and grandfather, he thought about going further inside and heading down to the drawings below. But he knew he had no need to. Instead, it was to the Godswood that he went, passing Rhaenys along the way, as she rested by the pool, his sister sleeping far more comfortably and truly than she had for days. Kneeling in front of the tree, he offered up his prayers to the old gods and placed his hand on the bark, soon finding himself to be walking in a glade full of them and seeing Leaf and Lady Melora beckoning him forward. "You've done well, my prince. I had prayed it would be so, and though I'm pained by your loss, I take comfort in your resolve." Melora said, her voice almost seeming different to him, firmer, more true, and less like the lady she had been. "My aunt?" he asked, and saw Melora smile. "I had thought to speak to you, to tell you what you must do to bring her back, and yet I had no need. Your actions showed that you already walked the path," Melora said. She can be brought back, he asked, though he'd hoped so, declared so. A part of him had feared it beyond him. She can. You've weakened him, my prince. Each one you take from him weakens him, his generals most of all. Had you not then, by now she'd be lost. Even to you. She is not, though time runs out eventually, and should he grow stronger, Melora said, her words sounding worried and yet her tone was still the same. You seem different, he said, looking at her, the small smile she wore now changing into a fuller one. I am who I'm meant to be, my prince, the three-eyed raven sees once more, she said, and before he could ask her to help him see, he felt her hand upon his forehead and the images flashed through his mind, the inkling of a plan he had now been shown to him and improved upon. When he opened his eyes, it was to the sounds of the army arriving, and so he made his way to the gates so that they could see him here. Joey, noticing immediately how the sight of him relaxed Jaime and his uncles, though they weren't alone in seeming pleased to see him, Mance wearing a large smile, as did Tormund and Arthur and Jorah relaxing. Perhaps most of all, Your Grace, Jaime said as he reached him, Jay nodding to him and then joining them as they walked inside. You set the fires? Benjen asked with a smirk, the warmth of the great hall hitting them as soon as they entered it. Aye, I figured you'd most welcome it after your march. That we would, nephew, you didn't happen to cook too, did you? Oberyn asked, and Jay enjoyed the pout he made when he told him he'd not. Later, after they'd eaten and others had taken to their bed, the march tiring them out and none really wishing for anything more than rest, Jay sat in his uncle's solar and readied to tell them what he'd seen. He's using the wolf's wood, daring me to set it alight, he said, and saw his uncle Ned look at the Great Jon and Rickard Karstark concernedly. Don't worry, uncle, I'll not, he added, seeing the relief on all three of their faces. Would it not be best to do so, your grace? Garland asked. I mean, should they be inside, would it not be best to set it alight, to allow the trees themselves to do what needs must be done? It would not only be a wasted effort, but a costly one too. Garland, when they attacked the wall, I tried to do so with the haunted forest, only to watch the flames. Rhaenys laid down be extinguished just as quickly, were it for that alone it would give me pause. But the wolf's wood is too important to the north to be set ablaze, he said, seeing his good brother's look of agreement. Then you'll be flying with us, marching with us, your grace, his uncle Ned asked, hopefully. And Jay shook his head. There is more I can do, and so, not for the now, uncle, he said to some worried looks. Waking early the next morning, he made his way to Mickens' forge, smiling when he found the boxes and calling for some men to pile the dragon glass into sacks. Then, after saying his goodbyes to his uncles, cousins, good brother, and to Jaime, he and Arthur made their way to Rhaenys and took to the sky. Their flight took what felt to be no time at all, and though he didn't see them beneath him, he felt them. The space he had Rhaenys land in was perfect, and before she did so, he had her fly in a circle while he and Arthur emptied out the dragon glass. Only when the bags were almost empty did he then tell her to land. I don't agree with this. It's too dangerous, Jay, she said, and he knew his words wouldn't be as comforting as he wished. I know, Ray, but I have faith that I'm doing the right thing, for us and for Sherka, he said, and he found himself looking into her deep purple eyes, the worry she had for him clear to see. This is not my day to die, Ray, and I swear it to you that we'll be flying together soon. Trust me, please. His sister didn't say anything as she took to the air. Her concerns were soon mirrored by Arthur's as the knight told him that he, too, didn't agree with this. Jaxus nodded as he reached into his shirt and took out the pouch containing the blood. It took him a few moments to coat the blade, and though the light was dim, it would not be for long. When I tell you, close your eyes, Arthur, close them and keep them closed no matter what, he said firmly. That's an order, Arthur, he said, and saw the reluctant nod that Arthur gave him to signal he'd comply. They came in force, the dead first of all, and as they moved towards him, he looked to Arthur and bid him close his eyes. Jay then kneeling down and beginning to sing. The stones moved first. The rocks that made this a place where trees couldn't grow were plentiful, and they were large, and as he sang, they crashed into the dead, crushing them, breaking them, and as his song grew louder, more and more of them flew through the air. Even after they had landed and done their work, they never stilled, his song soon taking them back into the air, and finding more and more targets. Above him and Arthur, Rain 6 flew, and it was through his sister's eyes that he saw them. How many he couldn't tell. 5, 6, perhaps even more, but they moved past the stones, as if they were gliding across the snow. Their speed was more than a match for how fast the stones flew in the air. They would not be a match for what flew next. As Lightbringer shined even more brightly and Jay looked to the dragon glass, the sound of ice breaking was not the loudest sound he could hear, nor was the dead that fell or even the song itself. That honor belonged to the loud screeches the White Walkers made when they realized they'd walked into a trap. Their pained screams as the dragon glass that he'd spread all around the open space now flew through the air and hit home. Stones they could dodge, though there were many of them, they were lesser than the pieces of dragon glass that Jade had chosen. Small pieces, broken pieces, cracked and damaged pieces. None good enough for weapons and yet perfect for what he needed them for. Looking through Rhaenys' eyes, he could see the dragon glass fly as if it was black snow in a snowstorm. He watched as it hit home, and as White Walkers and dead alike were struck by it. Somewhere further back where it was safe, the Night King himself stood, and were he a man, he'd have ranted and raved. What he did do, though, was fear. Something that Jay welcomed and then wished him to feel even more of. "We move, Arthur. We move now," he said as he sang the last note and watched the dragon glass fly from the empty space and through the trees themselves. "My king," Arthur said, pointing to his nose, and Jay welcomed the handkerchief he handed him as he bid Rhaenys land. He allowed the blood soak into it and put Lightbringer back in its sheath. Then he and Arthur ran to the dragon and within a moment were flying away. How many he'd killed? He knew not, but he knew he'd struck a big blow today. The Night King could keep to the trees while he for now marched with his own army and brought comfort to his men as best he could. There would be fewer chances to limit his numbers from here on in. The true fight drawing ever closer, and yet as they flew towards Winterfell, Jay felt he'd done enough. He hoped he had. Losses. The armies of those who fight to bring the dawn, none. The Night King, 40,000 dead to the flames. 50,000 due to the loss of the White Walkers. The 7 White Walkers. 4 moons since arriving at the wall, 3.5 since the long night fell. Doran 301 AC. Malario. Watching the world turn to darkness had been perhaps the single most disturbing thing she'd ever experienced. Living in eternal night, seeing people panic as the sun no longer rose had almost left her at wit's end. Yet watching her daughter calm people and bring order where there was none had made her prouder than she had ever dreamed. Urienne, despite her own worries and concerns, both for the babe that grew within her and her husband who was off fighting a war, had put them aside for her people. Her words resonated, and when she told them that her husband and his dragon were fighting for the people of Doran alongside her uncle, their prince, and the king himself, Malario had seen some of the worries fade away. When she then saw that torches were lit and placed to offer the most light they could, and that guards were to roam the streets carrying lanterns, not to subdue, but to protect and offer assurance, then people soon began to calm. Now moons later it had become almost an afterthought that you went to bed and rose to a moonless night. Her eyes had become accustomed to it, her moods had no longer swung because of it, and instead it was the babe her daughter carried that became her concern. That Tyrion wasn't here to hold Arianne's hand was something that she knew had led to tears falling from her more than once. Not having Ilaria and her cousins, Oberyn and even Trystane here, had only added to those tears. So Malario had done her best to offer her the comfort that those who weren't here could not. She knew she had helped and that her daughter appreciated that help. Yet each night she went to her bed, Malario prayed to any god that would listen to see this night end, and her family returned safely to her. For Tyrion was her family now, and she worried should he not return, then her daughter's heart would be broken. Never to recover, not even the babe she was so close to delivering would fix the wound in her heart. Should she lose her husband, Malario feared. It was why when the letters arrived she was so relieved to see Arianne's mood improve so completely. "Mother! From Tyrion!" Arianne said happily as she read it, her daughter smiling more than wiping her eyes, which was something she was grateful for. "What does he say, my love?" she asked once Arianne had finished. "That the fight goes well, and that their plans are working. He says the wall has fallen, and yet he welcomes it, as that was not the fight they were meant to face. Oberyn is safe and well, or as well as he ever can be," Arianne said with a chuckle, and she wondered if Tyrion had used those exact words. That he misses me and wishes he could hold my hand and rub my feet when they pain me so. Arianne said, smiling broadly now. She listened as her daughter told her the things she could, and withheld things that she knew were between a man and wife. Oberyn's letter had her laughing even more, and Malario thanked her good brother for bringing her such cheer. Their dinner that night was a most welcome one. The mood in the palace improved dramatically by Arianne's own joy. Malario even noticing a smile on Ario's face as her daughter made fun of her faithful guard. When she took to her bed, it was in a much better mood than it had been when she woke, and yet her worries were soon to return. The sounds of screaming woke her up, and she ran barely dressed from her room to her daughter's to find it a hive of activity. Master Miles, some acolytes, Aureo, and some of Arianne's ladies all huddled around the bed as her daughter cried out in pain. Ari, my love, she said, moving to her, and not realizing it was the babe that was causing her daughter's distress. Were it not for Miles's words, she'd not have gotten an answer either, as Arianne was in no state to do so. The babe is coming, my lady. I needs must see to the princess, Miles said, and when Malario moved to send the girls away, Arianne grabbed her hand and shook her head, thinking she was leaving her alone. I'll not leave you, my love, I swear it, she said, as Arianne nodded relievedly. It took her some time to get the ladies to leave, their worries for their princess and friend clear, and only her ordering them to do so seemed to do the trick. Once they were gone, she then moved back to the bed and took a seat beside her daughter. Malario's hand reached out for Arianne's, and the look her daughter wore showed her gratefulness that she was not alone, and yet her worry for what was to come. All will be well, Ari. The babe is coming, and soon you'll be holding your child in your arms, and all else will simply cease to be, she said as she stroked her head gently. Tyrion, Arianne asked worriedly, has his own work to do, and when he returns you can show him the babe that you and he made together, she said softly, her smile one to comfort rather than a true one. Arianne began, but Malario shook her head. You and my grandchild will both be well, Ari. I know this is true with all my heart. Take comfort in my surety, my love. Take comfort in that, she said as she leaned forward and kissed her daughter's forehead. The night seemed never-ending, which, given it had not for moons, was something that would have made her laugh had she not been so worried about her daughter. 3 babes she'd brought into the world, and all had come easier than this one, and despite herself, a part of her feared for the worse. Seeing the blood being cleaned up, this was even more so. Miles, though, showed no such concerns. Arianne, despite the pain she was going through, bore it well, and so she resolved to think likewise. At what point she heard the sound of the babe crying out she knew not, only that she looked down to see the tuft of dark hair and to hear the babe proving that they had a fine set of lungs. The babe, Ari, the babe is here, she said as her daughter closed her eyes from the exertion. A boy, princess? A healthy boy, Miles said, his smile beaming as he held the babe and handed him to one of the acolytes to clean. It took some time for him to clean up the bed and to change the sheets. Yan dozing off to sleep while he did so. Malario looked worriedly at her daughter, only for Miles to smile at her and shake his head. The princess is well, my lady. Never have I seen a more healthy mother and babe, Miles said as she looked at him and tried to discern if he was lying. For true, master? She asked, and he nodded vigorously. On my oath, my lady, I have no concerns for either the princess or the prince. I swear it. Miles said, and Malario felt a weight being removed from her at the words the younger man spoke. Rising to her feet, she walked to the small crib her grandson was laying in, her hand reaching down to touch his fingers and laughing. When he gripped one of her own, his little ones were not able to fully grasp it, and yet she felt his strength and was comforted greatly by that and by his smile. He was as tanned as her daughter was, and the hair on his head as dark as Arianne's too. His eyes, though, were a bright green, and were striking as they took the world in, or seemed to at least. My babe, where's my babe? Arianne called out worriedly from the bed, and so Malario reached down and picked her grandson up and carried him to the bed. Your son, my love, your healthy and beautiful son, she said as she handed her daughter the precious bundle. To see such joy on her eldest child's face was something she'd take with her to her grave. True and total and complete. Malario, believing that to be allowed to witness such a thing, was surely a gift from the gods. Lowen, my son, my sweet son, Arianne said as she smiled beamingly at the babe she held, and Malario felt the name was a worthy one for the future of their house. White Harbor, King's Landing, 31 AC. Wyman Manderley. The world falling into darkness was perhaps the scariest thing he'd faced in his life, other than the births of his sons and granddaughters. Was he a younger man when it happened? Then it may have stilled him to inaction, such was the worry it caused. Wyman, though, was an older, more experienced man than he had once been, and his duties and responsibilities weren't just to his family, but to his people and his king too. That he'd had help from his sons, his granddaughter, and her betrothed, and from his most loyal men, was something he was grateful for, and so he'd immediately set White Harbor to rights. Torches were lit, guards were put on patrol, so his people felt safe, and had someone to easily reach out to and help assuage their own doubts and worries. Preparations were made for those who hadn't yet arrived at the city to be brought to it post-haste. Wylis taking on the responsibility himself to send out parties of guards with torches and supplies so that they could escort the large and small groups that now made their way to White Harbor in total darkness. Watching Wool and Martin brought a smile to his face and comforted him greatly. His granddaughter and her betrothed taking on the responsibility to go out and about in the city to speak to and offer comfort to any that they could. Wendell remarked on it more than once about just how good a job they did, and it made him proud to see them both show such initiative. In time, a new normal had begun to take hold in the city, the night an annoyance rather than something to be fearful about, and life returning to somewhat normal. Then the birds chirped loudly, and his king's message was received loud and clear. "Find my sons and granddaughter, have Sir Martin and Sir Marlin brought to me," he said to his guards and his servants, each of them rushing off in different directions once he'd given his orders. He had hoped this day would not come, that his king's worst fears would remain simply that. So much so that he and Jane Sirrett had almost argued when he'd been told that his sons wouldn't be riding with him to the wall. Weird knowing they'd both feel the shame of it, until he'd then been told that neither would Howland, Jorah, or Meg, and that there were others of the South who'd not be going. That and that they would be far more needed where they were. "I'll not take Martin either, Wyman. Though I need fierce fighters with me, I'll not take many who I'd name as good and true. Lord Geryon will remain in the west, Sir Berestan, and more of the King's Guard with my wife and daughter in King's Landing. The Storm Lords and most of the Vale Lords too will have their own parts to play, and that won't be at the Wall or in the north." Geryon said, looking at him far more seriously than he normally did. "You fear you'll lose," he said, almost shocked. "I will win, Weeman, no matter what I must do. I will win, for I can't afford to lose. So no, it's not a fear of a loss that makes me do this. I may have a need to see the north evacuated. The entire north, every man, woman, and child. I may have a need to call upon men to add to mine own forces, and I'll certainly have a need for men to organize and protect those who cannot fight." Jack said as he laid out his plans, and Weeman was stunned at the scale of them, and to find that it wouldn't just be him taking the people of the north to the south. Wylis and Wendell, along with their captains, had adapted those plans somewhat. They'd arranged for ships to be filled with supplies of food, blankets, and water, and had called back the entirety of their fleet. By the time night had fallen, there was not enough room in White Harbor itself to dock all their ships. He had even needed to take a boat himself to the Western Wolf to see that their passage was clear when the time had come, which it now had, and he breathed relievedly to see both his sons, Sir Marlin, Wyla, and Martin arrive as quickly as they did. "The time has come. The king's orders have been given. Every man, woman, and child are to board a ship and to set sail for King's Landing," he said to a shocked gasp from Wolle, which Martin's embrace soon comforted. "It has truly come to this, father?" Wylis asked, worriedly. "The king planned for such a contingency. It's up to us to see those plans are carried out. I wish to be at sea by week's end," he said, and both his sons and Sarah Marlin nodded, as did Sarah Martin and Willa too. Now that she'd composed herself, "It was to be sooner than that," Wyman, stunned by how quickly and orderly the ships were loaded and had begun to set sail. How many people were in his city by the time the call had come, he knew not. But within 5 days of that call, it was a very easy question to answer: none. He himself was the last to board a ship, the city in darkness as he walked on board carrying the last remaining lit torch, and swore to himself that he and they would return. This was not like his family's exile from the Reach. This was a tactical retreat, nothing more. As per his instructions, the Western Wolf set off at a quicker pace than the other ships had, Woman wanting his flagship to lead the way and be the first to arrive in King's Landing. It was not cowardice nor a sense of self-importance that were his reasons for this. Instead, it was knowing that his people needed to see him lead, and once they arrived in King's Landing, it would be to him they'd look first. He, his sons, Martin and Willa, would each play their part in seeing their people settled when they arrived, and they needed to be there first to do so. Our king fights the good fight, and I've no doubt he and the good men of the Northwest, Dorne, and all those who fight alongside him will be victorious. We have set sail not because I fear defeat, but because our king bid us to. Your safety is the king's, and mine own's greatest concern, and so fear not, and know that the long night shall not last forever, and our exile shall be but temporary," he said as he addressed those who sailed the Western Wolf with him. He'd mixed them up with the wealthy merchants of the city, and the poorest of his people along with those who'd come from far and wide. Each of them was equally important to his king, and so he'd agreed with Martin and Wella when they'd suggested he fill the ships this way. "3 cheers for the king and those who fight for the dawn," Wendell called out. "The king and the warriors of the light," Martin shouted. "The king and the warriors of the light. The king and the warriors of the light. The king and the warriors of the light." Men, women, and even children cheered loudly on deck. And below it, across the entire fleet, he knew words similar to their own were being shouted too. Morale was important, and he'd not have them arrive in King's Landing already broken and fearful. As they passed Seal Rock, he knew that were he not on his ship and listening to the cheers there, and instead was standing on the rock itself, he'd have heard them ring out in the night. As it was, though, he'd not change where he was for anything in the world. Wyman knew he was exactly where his king wished him to be. The winds were good, and the seas smooth, and he felt the gods were on their side, both his king's and his own. Each night he invited different people to sup at his table. A common family of 3, a merchant and his wife, the captain of his guards, and his family. Whaley and Martin alternated from sitting with him and his sons to sitting at another table with children, small folk and nobles alike, their conversation never stilting, and his granddaughter and her future husband entrancing each and everyone with the ease they spoke to them. It took less than a week to see Blackwater Bay, or to arrive at it at least, as it was hard to see much in the bay itself. Something you could not say about the city, as King's Landing shone brightly like a beacon, and he knew he was not alone on the deck of one of their ships, looking out at the lights with a smile on his face. As they docked, he heard the gasp from Willa, and it took him a moment to see why that was. The sight of Ghost and the men in white cloaks only paling by the sight of the queen as she held the princess and welcomed them to the city herself. Wyman almost hurrying down the gangplank to take a knee in front of her. "Your Grace," he said almost disbelievingly. "Rise, Lord Wyvern, and be welcome to King's Landing," the queen said, smiling beamingly at him and at Wella, Martin, and the others, the princess in her arms, and he swore she wore the exact same smile on her face. "Sirs Alzier and Jeremy, along with the men of the Dragon's Teeth, will see that the good and true men and women of the North are helped to their accommodations, and your own rooms at the Red Keep are already prepared for you and your family," the queen said, as Wella moved forward to look at the princess and laugh when, with a nod from the queen, she was allowed to hold her. "I thank you, Your Grace, as does the North itself," he said. "There is no need, Lord Wyman. The North and yourself are most welcome here. Most welcome indeed," the queen said, as then he turned to Lady Dacey, who welcomed him just as warmly. A little further away stood Lady Sansa, Lady Joy, Lady Mira, and the queen's other ladies in waiting. Wyman looking at them as they stood by, while carts carrying food for his people and sweet candies for the children were moved closer. The girls themselves then began to hand it out to those who had disembarked the Western Wolf and the other ships that had since joined them. The queen stayed a number of hours, and even when her mother had come to take the princess back to the Red Keep, Ghost following behind them both as they left, Marjorie still stayed to welcome as many as she could herself, all her ladies of waiting too, as well as some young girls he knew not who spoke to the children, and soon had them laughing. All did everything they could to make their arrival a pleasant one. It took 2 days to empty the ships, far less time than it had taken to fill them. Wyman was amazed by how organized they were and by the arrangements they had made. He and his family were housed in rooms adjoining his office, and though he'd welcomed them, he had also insisted that he be taken to where his people were to be housed. There were manses with gardens filled with tents, large buildings that, though cramped, weren't overly so, and some were even housed with the families that lived in the city. None seemed perturbed by this, not even those who had known a more luxurious life in White Harbor. "We're all in this together, my lord," Little the Chambers told him as he, his wife, and daughter moved into a single room with 3 beds. The man was a silversmith who owned a large premises in White Harbor, and yet Wyman had not doubted that he meant the words he spoke. "Our king will be more than happy to know that, Rindal," he said, and the man laughed. "I look forward to seeing him again, though, at least for now, my girl can see the ghost once more." As he settled into his own rooms, Martin came to him bearing a note that he'd been given by the queen. A note not written in her hand, and instead written in his king's, and as he read it, he wiped a tear from his eye. The words that it bore were simple and direct. and yet to him they meant the world. Wyman, thank you for all you've done. It will be remembered by a most grateful friend. JD, the West and the Riverlands 301 AC. Kevin, after he had brought the ships in and seen the people settled, he then readied for what he needed to do. The men he'd gathered would soon be set to ride, and he with them, and he both looked forward to it and wished he'd not needed to go. Not for himself, he longed to take part in the fight to come, to play his part and see the realm safe and his family secure. It was for Dorna, Lancel Willem, and Janie, and for his sister, brother, and grandnieces, and nephews. They held more family dinners in those last few days than he could count. Kevin was keen to spend as much time with his wife and children as he could while doing the same with his family at Casterly Rock. The night before he left, Girion bid him join him, and they soon made their way to the rock's highest point. His brother envied him, he knew, and yet he very much did not, as he had no wish to leave his wife until their child was born. Kevin knew how much it hurt his brother that he had found himself so torn, that he could not fight by Jaime, Tyrion, and Jaez's side or be with Joy in King's Landing. The role he'd been given was one that Kevin was sure was to force him to remain here. It made him wonder if Jay knew that his brother was to be a father again. Given all the other things he knew, it would not be something he'd put past him. For now, though, it was other thoughts that were in his head, and as they stood looking out on the darkness, he began to laugh, catching Girion by surprise. "Something amuses you, brother?" Girion asked, smirking. The view," he said, laughing, fuller now. "And what a view it is! Why, I swear I can see at least 5, maybe 6 feet. Girion said, laughing with him. The two of them perhaps looking like fools to the guards behind them. It took a few moments for the laughter to quiet down, the silence then an unwelcome one, and it was Girion who broke it. "Our sister is most wroth with you. Most wroth indeed," Girion said, and Kevin nodded. "She wishes me to stay, as does Dorna and the boys. Even Janie has begged me to. And by the gods, to have to refuse her was harder than anything I've done in my life. I'll not lie," he said before he turned to Girion. "You'll not tell me to stay?" he asked, and Girion shook his head. "I'll not. I wish I was able to go with you, that I'd not been ordered to stay behind by command of the king," Girion said, his annoyance and acceptance both coming across in his voice. "I understand the why of it, though. I'd simply remind you, what Jaina will no doubt. Though I wager our sister will do so far better than I. She does everything better than you, or me for that matter," he said to a laugh from his brother. That's the truth. By the gods, had she been born a son then, I fear the realm wouldn't have been able to contain her. It barely can, as it is," Girion said fondly before he turned to look at him, and then placed his arms on his shoulders before he pulled him into a hug. It was the first one they'd shared in gods knew how many years, and he was soon embracing Girion just as firmly as he was being embraced by him. "I love you, brother. Be safe. Take no more risk than is needed and return to your family. I love you, and I wished for you to know that," Girion said, and Kevin had to fight hard to keep his emotions in check. "I love you too, Girion. I'm glad we got the time we did, and I've no intention of this being the last time I see you," he said, and Girion laughed, catching him by surprise. "I should hope not. Our sister wishes to feast you before you leave. Only a fool would not turn up for one of Jane's feasts, and while you are foolish, brother mine, you're no fool," Girion said, Kevin chuckling even as they walked back down to the family wing. The feast had been a large one, and though Jane had kept a smile on her face, her worry and sadness at his departure was plain to see. 2 days after the feast, he said his goodbyes to his wife and children. Jane crying in his arms, and that alone was almost enough to make him stay. He told his wife how much he loved her, Lancel and Willem how proud of both of them that he was, and he kissed his daughter when she was back in her mother's arms. Tommen and Marcella he had hugged, and he told them they were both fine children, Lannisters through and through, regardless of the names they bore, and as their granduncle, he could ask for no truer kin than they. During Jape and made light, he'd kissed Ashara on the cheek and told her that he looked forward to meeting his new grandniece or nephew on his return, and then he'd stood face to face with his sister, who moved first, he couldn't tell, whose arms held who the tightest was unknown to him, who cried first, that had been him. "You are not to die, you hear me? You are not to die. Bring them back to me, Kevin. Bring our family back, all of them. Jaime, Tyrion, Loras, and Jay, you bring them back, and you bring yourself back. Or else when I see you in the next world, you'll face my wrath." Jen whispered in his ear as he held her tightly. "I love you, little sister," he said. I know. I love you too, big brother," she said, and as he moved away from her and climbed on his horse, he prayed to the Seven that he'd see her once again. Sailing to Seagard found a change come over him. Worries, doubts, fears all seemed to fade away, and it took him some time to realize why that was. It wasn't that he didn't feel any of those things, it was that he couldn't bring them into battle with him. So by the time they arrived and he and his men had left the ships and rode out of the city, he was in a frame of mind that he knew would serve him well. Behind him, he led almost 5,000 men, all mounted and all men who'd volunteered to follow him into this fight. Not one man had he ordered to do so, and not one man he'd looked in the eye had refused to come. It had made him so very proud of them, and though there were some fears, as they reached the rest of the army, they soon faded away. Even Kevin himself was shocked by the sheer size of it, and more so later on when he spoke to Lord Tydos, Lord Yen, Cider, Richard, and others, and found that the king, Jaime, the princess, and Tyrion, and their men hadn't yet arrived. They were given tents, and over the next few days, their orders, though they were told that when the king himself arrived, those orders would or could be changed. Less than a week after arriving, he had been walking in the camps with Sara Richard when the dragons were seen, the princess and Tyrion had arrived, and Kevin was not the only man that cheered loudly at the sight of them. The Riverlands, 301 AC. Rosieros, they had marched and marched hard, stopping off in keeps and keeping to the rivers where they could. Each day they'd done so, the prince and princess would take to their dragons and bring the fight to the army of the dead. While he, Garin, and their men had not fought one battle or one skirmish even since they'd left Eastwatch, it had at first frustrated him greatly. Loras feeling they were running away rather than fighting, and not truly understanding why that was. Jaxley was no craven, and though they'd suffered losses, they were still almost completely intact. The men were itching for a fight, as was he, and yet there was no fight to be had. Instead, they marched, set up camp, woke early the next day, and repeated the process. For weeks, moons, this had been their routine, and it was only that it was so damn tiring, or the complaints would have begun. As it was, questions had started to be asked, doubts had crept in, and faith in their king and his plans had begun to waver. He'd done his best to let people know that their king had a plan. Tyrion and Daenerys, too, had spoken up and done a more than decent enough job. He felt, yet it was Garin who had probably best of all managed to offer up the words that were needed, both to the men and to him himself, as they would lay together in their tent. Jace had a plan, he said, and he knew that Loras believed in his king more than any, so why would he doubt him now? Why would he not think that all they were doing was all that was needed to be done? Garin had questioned him and made him admit something he wasn't sure he was ready to admit, his own fears and doubts soon coming to the fore. I fear he wishes to keep me out of the fight, that our friendship clouds his mind, he said, as they lay in their bed, Garin shaking his head and brushing his hair from his face, hair that had grown much longer on this march. While I know how James thinks of you, I know that's not the case, Lorzia, true. He'd not wish you to risk yourself unnecessarily, but in time we'll all have no choice but to fight, and I believe Jay knows this better than any of us. Garin said, Then why are we not? He asked, not petulantly, but needing to know. Because we'll lose. Garin said, catching him so by surprise that his gasp was far louder than he had meant for it to be. We can't lose, he said determinedly, and so we'll not, Garin said, his tone matching his own. But you said, he asked confusedly. I said that if we fight, we'll lose, which is why we've not fought. What do you think Janson's doing right now? Or when the prince and princess fly off? What do you think they're doing? Facing the dead, he said, this time with some petulance in his voice. Taking the dead from him, Loziers, a few more each, and every day until the day comes and the true fight is upon us. Then we'll fight, all of us, then we'll fight and we'll win, Garin said. And Loras found he could not doubt his love's words. Garin said those same words to the men. The princess too spoke them aloud, as did Prince Tyrion. He too began to speak them to all who'd shown concern. Loras, adding in his own adventures with Jay and showing his own faith, was still as true as ever. Feeling somewhat shamed by the doubts he'd had, though knowing that perhaps he was not alone in doubting and that Jay himself perhaps doubted once or twice on this march, he knew that to be even more true when Tyrion told him of Aemon's fall, Loras shedding tears both for the prince himself and for how his friend would take the loss. When the letters arrived from his family, he shed even more tears, Margaery and his grandmother both writing in the same note, while his father, mother, and brother wrote in another. It comforted him to read their words and to imagine their voices as he read the letters, just as much as it comforted him that he'd been able to send his own to them to let them know he was well. "I miss you all too," he said softly, as he kissed each of the letters and placed them in a small pouch he wore on around his neck. When they reached the neck, he heard the cheers go up from the Northmen amongst them, those cheers only ringing louder when they reached the moat. The men were more than happy to have another keep to spend the night in, and Loras was keen to find out if news had arrived from Jaime and the others. In this, he was lucky, and yet not. News had arrived that they marched too. But that was it. Loras feeling somewhat disappointed in this, and yet, soon enough, they were marching again, and he then had other things to think about. Were someone to ask him how he knew they were no longer in the north, he'd not be able to tell them. Yet he knew, and just doing so gave him the strength to march a little straighter the next day, and the day after that. Loras then almost falling to his knees in shock when he saw the army that was spread out in front of them once they were in the Riverlands proper. He'd known that Jay had made other plans, but this was not what he'd expected. Rows upon rows of tents, wind wheels, catapults, and trebuchets, sigils from the Stormlands, Vale West, Crownlands, and the Riverlands themselves. And he swore he saw one or two that were from the Iron Islands. Apart from Dorne in the north, all the kingdoms were represented, and those that were missing were soon to arrive, led by their king. The entire realm had come out to face the threat that came their way, and his tiredness and last remaining doubts were soon a thing of the past. Loras smiling as they were greeted by Sir Richard Lonmouth and the Blackfish, and as he heard the dragons as they flew in the air. It was to be here in this place that the fight was to be won or lost, though not quite the trident itself as it was the green fork that flowed nearby. He felt a shiver go down his spine when he thought that it was to once again be that river that defined the course of the realm. "Solaras, it's good to see you. You too, Prince Garin," Sir Richard said, welcoming them both and taking Loras from the thoughts in his head. "Has there been word from the king?" he asked, foregoing the greeting for now, so eager was he to hear and to see Jayaz and Jaime once again. "They march, Loras, they march, and shall soon be with us, on that I have no doubt," Sir Richard said, and Loras nodded, for he too doubted it not. The neck 3001 AC. Oberyn. Was anyone to ask it of him? He'd freely admit he slept far better after they left Winterfell than he did any time up until then. Knowing that his nephew would be marching with them and not spending his days facing the dead upon Rhaenix's back was a comfort. Not just to him, Jaehaerys's other uncles and cousins, Ymay Garland or his Kingsguard, but to the free folk, Northmen, Night's Watch, and men of the Company of the Rose too. That his nephew wasn't as tired as he would be when he returned from facing off against the dead each day was a boon too. Nights were now spent in conversation, and with Jack singing and playing his harp, rather than his nephew almost needing to be forced to his bed. When they rode, Jaxley would take time to speak to men, to ride alongside different groups, and each night they camped would find his nephew strolling through the camp with Lightbringer in his hand, and that alone was something that raised spirits. Though Oberyn believed even were Jay to keep the sword sheathed, his presence, words of comfort, and thanks would have been more than enough to do so. His own spirits had been raised by the letters he had received as well, as had Yumay's, Garland's, Jay's other uncles and his cousins, and even some of the free folk. Mance finding out his wife and babe were safe and well on Dragonstone. What cheered them most and brought a smile to all their faces was the reaction and the shouts from Tormund when Jay himself read his letter to him. "What do you mean he fucking stole her?" Tormund shouted out loudly, Oberyn, Ned, and Jaime hurrying to the fire, where Jay sat with the large man and the other free folk chieftains, not out of any fear for Jane's safety as both Arthur and Jers were close by, and their swords remained sheathed. More for the potential of a night's japing and listening to Tormund rant and rave. You took your entertainment where you could get it while on the road, and Tormund was nothing if not entertaining. "I believe she stole him, Tormund." Jane said, a smirk that threatened to become a full smile on his face, while Benjen, Stark, and Val, along with Mance, all tried not to laugh too loudly. "A fucking kneeler? You're telling me my baby girl is now stuck with a fucking kneeler?" Tormund said angrily. "Maybe she couldn't find a bear in the woods, Tormund." Mance said, and Oberyn swore if looks could kill, then the king beyond the wall would be dead. "I'll not have it," Tormund said loudly and angrily before he quietened for a few moments, and then spoke again. "How do I know this man is worthy of my girl?" he added, with a loud sigh. "The man is good brother to the Small John, Tormund, kin to him, and you think the Small John worthy, do you not?" Jay asked, "Aye, for a fucking kneeler, he's not bad." Tormund said, resignedly. What's that you say about Goatsbane? The Small John said, laughing as he held his mug of ale in his hand and walked towards them. Tormund's got a new good son, Small John. His daughter stole herself a night. Your good brother, Sire Perwyn? Jack said, and Oberyn swore that he'd not seen his nephew so relaxed and full of life for many moons. A good man and true, Tormund. A man I'm happy to name as my good brother, even if he is a Frey. Small Jan said, and Oberyn almost fell down. He laughed so hard at the looks that Tormund shot his nephew, and the way that Jane moved back a little, in jest though it was. A Frey, a fucking Frey, a weasel, you'd have me give my daughter to a weasel. Tormund's voice boomed, and though he was angered, it was to laughs and no fears that his words were listened to. Save your breath for cooling your porridge, Tormund. Now take a fucking seat before I have Rhaenix. Take you in the air and drop you on your head until you see sense. Jane said, the lightness in his voice belying the words he spoke. But a weasel, Jet, Tormund said, almost whiningly as he all but collapsed beside Jay. Morel, it's going to be a long night. Jack said to loud laughs, his own among them, and Oberyn swore it was the first time any of them had laughed at those words since darkness had fallen. By the time Jay made for his bed, Tormund was very drunk and loudly daring anyone to speak ill of his new goodson. The next morning as they rode, he was happy to have Jay ride alongside him and Jaime Lannister. His nephew's spirits, too, had been raised by him riding with them, and Oberyn was perhaps even more grateful for that. As he had feared, the loss of his aunt and uncle would have been too much for him to bear. While Jay was certain that he could bring Shira back and Oberyn had full faith in him, he wasn't quite as sure. Emo, though, was lost to them, and while he, Yaemuled, Benjen, and even Arthur had brought it up, his nephew had no wish to speak on it. Not for now, at least. I'll mourn him for true, when I can. Oberyn, then I'll more than welcome an uncle's concern. Now I have too much to think on, too much to do, and so it's there. My mind must go, and there it shall. Jason and Oberyn had nodded, hoping his nephew knew best. They rode together for another day, and then finally he saw the moat in front of them. Turning to Jay, he could see the relieved breath that he took at the sight. While he didn't like that he flew on his dragon while they spent a night under the keep's roofs, he knew it was needed, and Jay had promised he'd not engage with the Night King unless he must. The next day, when they left the moat, it was with the entire household of the keep too. Oberyn, watching as Jay, Arthur, and Jorah rode to the end of the line, Jay waiting for the full army to march past before his nephew, then turned and rode too. I hope to return, sooner rather than later, Uncle, to see my mother's resting place and offer my respects once more, but not today. Jane said softly to him as they left the north. Not today. King's Landing 302 AC. Marguerite, she made her way to the small council chambers for the meeting. One that she had considered having in her own solar, but had decided not to. Given that it was only her, Gorman, Wyman, Montfort, and Willis, along with her grandmother, there was really no need to have it take place there, and yet, for some reason, she wished it to. Perhaps it was because she missed having them in the room, or maybe it was that being there made her almost see those who were not. Yaxley Oberyn, Sir Richard Lonmouth, and of course, her husband. Entering the room, she sighed when she looked to the two chairs side by side, and with a nod to Barristan, she waited until he'd moved Yance one away, and then she took her seat. Normally, she'd be the last to arrive, and she wasn't left waiting for long. But she'd for some reason wished to be here early. Sitting down in her seat, she closed her eyes, and it was almost as if she could see and hear them there in the room. Sir Richard telling them all the latest whispers from his lips. Oberyn trying to get Jay to laugh, Jaime laying out the key points they needed to know, and her husband speaking either firmly or making japs. When her grandmother took her seat and touched her hand, Marjorie for a moment forgot Jay wasn't here and called out his name. Jay, she said, smiling, only to open her eyes and to see her grandmother look at her sympathetically. Sweetling? Her grandmother said softly. And Marguerite shook her head and offered up a smile to tell her that she was feeling well and wasn't upset, only the first part of that true. Lord Montfort and Graham the Axter Gorman were the next to arrive, and then Willis and Wyman arrived together a few moments later. Marguerite was happy to have the Lord of White Harbor here in King's Landing, and she knew that her husband would be much relieved that he, his family, Martin, and the people of White Harbor and beyond had made it without loss. She waited until they had taken their seats and began the meeting, asking Lord Montfort if preparations were ready should their own signal to evacuate come. They are your grace, as Lord Wyman did in White Harbor, We've brought the entire fleet back to Westeros. They stand ready should they be needed. Lord Wanford said, and she gave the man a small nod to show her pleasure at his words. Grandmaster, news from the realm? She asked. The Western Fleet stands ready, Your Grace, as do the ships that sailed from Bear Island. In Seaguard, the ships have already set off, and Lady Greyjoy has begun its own evacuation. Gorman said, the Northerners who marched, Your Grace. Lord Reed and Lady Stark. Wyman asked, and Margaery turned to look at him. We're to be moved to the Iron Islands as per His Grace's instructions. Lord Wyman, Seaguard was just a temporary respite, she said. And while she knew that Wyman, like others, had no great love for the Ironborn, he and they had accepted Asha to be a different sort, and in this, they were all in it together. Have the evacuations begun elsewhere? Grandmaster, her grandmother asked, and the Grandmaster shook his head. I'm not certain, my lady. Though I would imagine if Seaguard is being evacuated, then any keep north of it has too, and in time, those to the south. The Grandmaster didn't finish his words upon seeing her expression, Gormo knowing full well that the only reason those south of the Twins would be given word to abandon their homes was if the worst happened. Some places, like Seaguard, were too close to the line Jay had drawn across the realm and would need more time to be evacuated, and so couldn't wait. Others would only be so if they were not able to hold that line. Food well as, how are our stocks? She asked, changing the subject as she turned to her brother. Very good, Your Grace. We've been well prepared, and Lord Wyman ensured that they brought as many supplies with them as could be carried. I've no fear that we'll run out, my queen. Wella said, and Marjorie turned to her grandmother. The harvest, she asked, seeing her grandmother smile. Most was gathered before the long night fell, leaving little to be harvested once it had. The resowing was more problematic, but your father assures me it's been done. The lack of sun, however, may mean that next year's harvest will be of a poorer quality. Her grandmother said, and Margaery took great relief in that. This year, get through this year, and then they'd find a way to manage the next. I thank you all, she said, rising. Her grandmother doing likewise, and it was with her by her side that she walked from the room. It did comfort her, the words she'd heard in her daily walks in the city, to see the people were doing well. She knew that it comforted the people to see her and speak to her, to listen as she told them all that Jaxley was doing. Margaery making up most of it, as she truly knew not exactly what it was her husband did. Other than fight to protect the realm, his family and her, and Aelia most of all. As she reached her room, she heard the sounds of laughter, and entering it, she found Joy, Joanna, Beleriand, and Ghost, all playing with Aelia. The words the girl was speaking to her daughter, quickly bringing a smile to both her and her grandmother's faces. You like strawberries, Leia. Strawberries yummy. Bala no like. Only Anna. Me and you like strawberries. Go for ride on horsey, on apples. No, not now, when you're bigger. On dragon. Soon you'll have indoor horsey too, won't you, Anna? She saw her grandmother shake her head in amusement at Joy's little game. Margaery looking over to her mother and to Daisy, who sat a few feet away, and she wondered where Jon was only to see him laying on the couch, asleep. As soon as her daughter saw her, her games with Joy and Joanna were forgotten, and Margaery was soon laughing as Aelia ran to her. Mama Strawbelly, Aelia said, her face and dress covered in berry juice, and Joy looking at her guiltily. Why, thank your princess, she said as Aetia giggled when she picked her up in her arms and then almost stuffed the strawberry in her mouth. Later that night, after they'd eaten and she'd put Aetia to bed, she lay in her own and felt the tears threaten to fall. Their daughter had grown up so much, her dragon had grown so much, and Jade had missed it all. More than 4 moons he'd been away from them, and it was getting harder and harder for her to manage without him. Not the realm, or even with Aetia. Her daughter had been told by her, by Joy, and by others, that her papa had gone to bring the dawn. Something she had then interpreted as her father was chasing the sun on his dragon's back, and when he caught it, then he would return. No, for Marjorie. It was for herself that she was having trouble. She missed the feel of him in her arms, his lips when he kissed her, and the nights and sometimes days when they lay together. Reaching to the table beside her bed, she took the chest and opened it. Inside were the gifts that he'd given her over the years, the letters he'd written her, and the small pin he'd given her. After what had happened with Jane Chiere in King's Landing, she'd wished for nothing to do with this pin. She'd thrown it away only to be relieved when Chiere gave it back to her. The pin wasn't evil or bad, it was a gift given in love, and so she'd welcomed its return. Now even more so as she once again pricked her finger and prayed that she'd see her husband again. "Please, take me to my love," she said softly as she closed her eyes. The glade was empty as she moved through it, the weirwood tall and true, and she looked to see Jon standing there. He was taller, older, his hair was longer and his body more filled out. She moved towards him and he turned and smiled. The red three-headed dragon pendant clear even in the dim light of the glade. "I knew you'd come," he said, and she found herself lost in his touch as he reached his hand out to brush it against her face. "Always, Jon, what is this place?" she asked. "This is our place, my love, a place for us to be who we truly are," Jon said, and as his fingers wrapped around her own, she looked at the ring on his hand. The ring was the Targaryen sigil, the three-headed dragon, though, quartered, and she had never seen Jon wear it before, nor had she ever seen him so clearly dressed as what he was, a dragon. When he moved in close, she felt his lips on hers, felt his hands as they wrapped around her, and next she knew they were leaning against the tree, her head resting against his own. "I must go soon, my love. The fight is almost here," Jon said, and she looked at him, willing him to stay. "I don't want you to fight," she said, shaking her head. "Yet fight I must. I will win, and I will see you soon. Farewell, my love," she heard his voice say, as she found herself alone in the woods. She remembered, she knew this place. This had been, was it then, or was it now? "Jaxa," she called out, and then she saw him. He was running towards her, and then she felt his arms around her, as he lifted her up, and those lips she'd missed so very much were kissing her own. "Is it, Jay? Are you here? Is this a dream?" she asked as she stared into his eyes. "No, the pin, you used the pin?" he asked, and she nodded as she bit her lip, the worry coming to her then. "Marge, I think, gods, how could we not know?" he said as he took her hand and led her to the tree. "No?" she asked, confused. "It wasn't then, Marge. It was now. We were given a glimpse of now," he said softly as they sat down. Marjorie leaning back against him and feeling his arms go around her once more. The comfort they offered was one she could get nowhere else. "Are you safe, Jan? Is it nearly done?" she asked worriedly, and she felt him kiss her cheek. "I'm as safe as I can be, Marge." "And it's near the end," he said, and she shivered a little. "Yeah. Tell me of our daughter," he said, and she began to tell him all he'd missed. Feeling his sadness over each moment, and then hearing him laugh as she told him of the honors that Joy would bring her and Joanna on. "I always knew she would. She is well, Marge. Joy, Joanna, Jon, Sansa, and all the others. They are well?" he asked, and she nodded, feeling him kiss her once more. "They are. Our daughter, Jay. The people love her so. When I go out to speak to them, it's she. They look to and not me. She and her dragon, which she wanted to name Strawberry, though I convinced her not to, for now," she said. And the laughter she heard was as true as it ever had been. "I miss you both so much. I long to see her and you, to hold you both, and it's that which gives me strength, my love. You have always been my strength. Thank you for doing so. Now," he said, and she turned to look at him, his eyes glassing over as she moved her hand to them and wiped the tears that threatened to fall. "As are you mine own strength, Jax, mine and Eatria's," she said softly. "Tell them all I miss them so, Marge. Tell Daisy that Jaime wishes he could be by her side and that he loves her and their children. Tell my aunt that Oberyn feels the same, and his girls that their father is so very proud of them. Let your mother, father, and grandmother know that their brothers are resolute. Lors is happy, Marge. He's found love and is happy, and Garland, I'm happy to have him with me, and yet wish I could send him away." Jade said. "You cannot," she said, and he nodded, knowing it was a command, and not a question. As much as she wished her brothers safe with her, what they needed to do was more important. "Tell my sisters that their brother misses them so much, that he, too, is so very proud of the women they're growing to be, and that he longs to see them, longs to walk in the gardens with Sansa and to ride with Apples and Joy." "I will, Jess. I will. I promise," he said as she kissed him repeatedly. "I love you, Marge, you, our daughter. My heart is full of you both, and that is why I'll beat him. That is how I'll beat him. There is nothing stronger in this world than that, Marge. No magic is more powerful than the love I feel for you both. I wish I could be there with you now, but I cannot. For now I cannot, and all I can say is that the dawn is coming. Marge, I will bring it, and then I will see those I love again," Jane said, his determination putting her fears at rest. And she leaned close to him. "I love you, our daughter loves you. Come back to us, Jay. We need you with us," she said as he nodded. Together always, he said, and she smiled. Together always, she said as she kissed him and then felt him fade away. Waking in her bed, she hugged the pillow even more tightly and heard Elia as she called out for her. She hurriedly climbed out and made her way to her daughter's small bed, which for now was close to her own. Mama, Elia said happily. I dreamt of Papa. We flew, Mama. We flew and chased the sun, her daughter said, smiling beamingly, and Marguerite lifted her in her arms and held her tight. He's bringing the dawn, my love. He's bringing it so he can come back to us, she said. And the fear that she had he would not was lessened greatly by the hope and belief that she had that he would. The Riverlands 302 AC. Jaehaerys Targaryen. He woke and almost expected to see her lying there beside him. The feel of her in his arms had been so true, so real, that he believed he was back with her and that it was not a dream. Only to wake and find himself alone in his tent. Yet he felt no disappointment that she was not here. And he knew that it had not been a dream. Last night he had held his wife in his arms and felt her kiss on his lips. He heard her speak, saw her face, and as he now dressed, he knew he was ready. With a nod to Arthur and to Jorah, he walked out from the tent, and as they followed behind him, he spoke to the men and told them that he was proud to serve with them. He thanked them, laughed with them, and by the time he made it to where the others were breaking their fast, he was the last to arrive. Jay taking his seat beside Jaime and Oberyn, and whispering first to one and then the other what had happened last night, thankful neither asked him if it was just a dream he had. After japing a little with his aunt and speaking to his uncles, he made his way to the dragons. All three of them were rested, and other than hunting for food, something they did easily, they'd not flown for almost a week. Leaning against Ronix, he shared with her his time with Marguerite and felt her happiness for him that he'd gotten to do so. His sister asked if they would fly today, and Jay said they would. It was or would soon be time, and while he felt her eagerness for it to be so, he felt her worry too. This what we were meant to do, Ray. What we were born to do. We end him. We end him, and then we bring them back. Our family, Ray. Valyria, you and me were born for this, and I am ready, he said, as he looked into her eyes. As am I, little brother. For those we lost and those we'll see returned, he said, and he moved away from her as she roared out her approval at his words, Aegon and Lygaron both doing the same. He moved to his son, leaning against his head, and told him how very proud of him he was. Lygaron's trills sounded loud as he heard his words, and Jay softly stroked his snout. Fly well and fly safe, my son. Protect your rider above all, and when this is over, you'll have a new dragon to fly with, he said, and as he moved from him, he heard his son's voice in his head. Be safe, father, Lygaron said, and Jay nodded. Making his way to the command tent, he stood looking at each of the men there, and whether it was his expression or not, he knew they knew it was to be today. I'll not make a long speech. Not here and not now. That I'll save for the men, he said to laughs. The time is upon us. The day we've been building to is here, and each of you knows what it is you must do. I thank you for all you've done up to now, and wish you to know that there are none I'd rather face what comes for us with than you. He said his words as sincere and true as they had ever been. As they began to leave the tent, he said no goodbyes. Instead, he hugged his uncles, his cousins, his aunt and uncle, and Sir Richard. Then turning to Loras, Jassards, and Arthur, he embraced each of them before he was left alone with Jaime in the tent. The two of them looking at each other, and who moved first he knew not. I am here because of you. The realm owes you more than it has ever owed a man before, and I owe you everything. No squire could have asked for a better knight. No king could have wished for a more capable hand, and no son ever had a truer father. I love you, father, thank you for everything, he said, and he barely heard the words. And he spoke back to him, though he had no need to, as he'd always know what he'd thought of him. Later that day, he watched as the men formed up, as Tyrion and Dany climbed onto their dragon's back. Jane himself was mounted on a horse, and wishing that winter was here and yet glad she was not at the same time. Ahead of him to the north caltrops, barriers, palisades, and pits had been dug, and though it would not stop the dead, it would slow them. Behind him the catapults were loaded, and the men who were to operate them and the trebuchets stood ready. The line stretched as far as the eye could see, and only that men bore torches and fires were lit to light arrows, or in the darkness they'd have disappeared from view. Jay rode his horse up and down the line, Lightbringer in hand, as he showed them all that their king was with them. In the darkness that they looked out to, he knew when they'd arrived, the air chilling just a little and making men shiver was a sign that he was right. We stand here today, not as lords, knights, princes, or kings, but as men and women, all who've answered the call. We come here not for glory, though some will be earned, not for renown, though it will come and be deserved. We come here because we serve a higher call, a truer one, from each of the 8 kingdoms. Those who follow the 7, who are one, the old gods, the many-faced god and the god of light. Yet we fight not for gods, though each of us does their bidding. We stand here today for those we love, those we wish to see safe, and those we would gladly lay down our lives for. Yet I would ask not one of you to lay down your lives gladly. I would beg you to not go quietly into the darkness. Instead, I ask you to fight. Fight with all you have, with all you are. Fight for those you love and those you wish to see again. Fight and know I fight with you. Know that I too miss those I love. That I too wish I was elsewhere, he said to loud laughs. His horse moved down the line, and he looked at the faces of the men and saw their courage, their willingness to fall if they must, and that his words had hit home and none would give up their lives easily. To the god of death, we say, begone, for you are not welcome here. To the Night King, we say, begone, for these are our lands. To the dead, we say, begone, for this is the land of the living. To the long night, we say, begone, for we are the warriors of the light, and together we shall bring the dawn, he said to loud cheers. The storm began, and he looked out as it moved closer. Climbing down from his horse, he cut his hand and let the blood seep into the blade, and then drove it into the ground. Behind him, men covered their eyes, and ahead of him, the storm retreated. And then in the light he saw the dead charge forward, and he called Rhaenys to him. Fire everything, he shouted loudly, and he watched as the barrels flew through the sky. Battle for the Dawn 302 AC, Riverlands. Sheer Richard Lonmouth. He had listened as his king gave a speech to the men while riding a horse rather than a dragon, and he had to admit it had been the right choice to do it that way. As impressive as it would have looked from Rhaenys' back, he doubted he'd have been able to ride along the line and look each man and woman in the eyes, something he was certain that Jay had wished to do. Richard was stirred by it. He had felt it resonate deep inside of him, and he believed the men felt it too. Listening to them laugh as the king said that he too wished to be elsewhere had been a welcome sound, as had their cheers when he'd finished speaking. Feeling the chill as the air grew colder around him, though, had taken some of that good cheer away. When he saw the light, he'd had to turn away, so bright was it. The chill, though, had retreated, and the light itself soon faded into one that he could at least look at, and then he heard the king's voice as it boomed out loudly in the quietness of the night. Fire everything, Jay shouted, and Richard grabbed his torch and waved it from side to side, hearing the sound of the catapults as they were loosed and the barrels flew through the air. Some men stood and watched after they'd fired the first set of barrels, almost as if they'd done their jobs, and it annoyed him greatly. Did you not hear the king? Everything. Fire everything, he said as the men began to reload the catapults with another barrel. Richard running down the line, shouting at others to do the same as he waved the torch in the air. Another volley. Then another, and then he heard them in the distance. The 2 dragons flying over their heads, riderless and with their own parts to play. Hold, he shouted, waving the torch up and down to send the signal for others to do the same. Then he, like those with him, turned to look out at the darkness, and he watched as Rhaegal and Sandorix laid down their flames. For a moment nothing happened, and then he heard the booming sound, and the world was once again bright. He saw the dragons as they flew high in the sky, both turning from where they had just flown over and now heading south once more. Their jobs were done, their part had been played, and looking up to them in the unearthly green light, he could see they were unharmed. The wildfire has been dealt with, my king, he said as he stood in James' solar. It's safe. I believe so. Not even a flaming arrow could set it alight, according to Thoros and the Red Priestesses. Richard said as he took a seat and looked to the king, who bore an odd look on his face. Your Grace. A dragon, Richard. Could a dragon's flames set it alight? Jackson Richard looked at him curiously. I don't know, Your Grace. Have a barrel brought to the dragon pit, Rornix, and I will see if it's so. Jake said, and saw his worried look. Far from here, Richard, he added, alleviating his concerns. And if it does, if Rhaenys can set it alight, he asked, and it could come in very useful in the future. Very useful, Jang said with a small smile on his face, and was he not who he was, then it would have concerned him a little. Richard, though, had no reason to be concerned by his king. He was as far from Aerys as any man could be, and so when he'd come to him and told him what he wished to do with the wildfire, he'd been amazed. Seeing it now and watching the world be lit up with green flames, he wore a large smile on his face. Aerys' greatest wish, what would have been his worst ever crime committed upon the realm, was now being used to save the realm by his grandson. The gods work in mysterious ways indeed, and as the range of the catapults was set further, he found himself just as eager as Aerys had been to see it burn them all. "Fire!" he shouted as the next barrels flew in the sky, and the explosion, when they landed, was a huge one. Richard ordered the men to let loose again, and soon enough, they were done. The realm was once again cleansed of wildfire, and this time he knew they had a king who would never see it made again. He took to his horse and ordered the men to reload with the broken dragon glass and the balls of pitch and rode down the line to make sure it had all been fired and used. To his right, men cheered as the green flames rose higher, and he thanked the gods. They'd gotten the distance right. There were hundreds of yards between their lines and the green flames, and yet he could still feel the heat that came from them, even as far back as he was. He looked on as arrows flew carrying flames of another sort, and then as rainix flew over his head towards the other dragons, and not the front, which brought him a huge amount of relief. Not just seeing that his king and the dragon were unharmed, but that he felt secure enough to do so. Yet as he reached the end of the line, he and others looked on as the green flames suddenly began to fall, and as their fire was extinguished. Then all three dragons were in the air, and this time it was the other way. His king flew to the fight, and not away from it. "Keep him safe, father and mother. Watch over him, maiden and crone. Give him strength, warrior and smith. Leave him be, stranger," he said as he rode to his men and readied to play his own part in the battle to come. Tulrin Snow. It was finally upon them, the fight the company had been formed to fight. And as he looked around at his men and at the others who'd come when the White Wolf had called, it made him believe, not in the White Wolf himself, Jaxie had already earned his and his men's belief 10 times over, but that they could and would win. Never had he seen such a force of men assembled. Never in history had one this size been gathered, and they would be needed in the battle they now found themselves in. While he'd never doubted the White Wolf, his actions had confused him and his men for some time. They weren't to scout the army they faced or to shadow them and report their movements as they marched. Apart from at the wall itself, they hadn't even engaged with them other than when the White Wolf had brought some of his men with him and at Queen's Crown. Jay choosing his battles and his grounds, and never was this more true than where they were now. Torreen and his men had marched, listened, followed orders, and it was only when they arrived in the Riverlands did he see it for true. Along the way the White Wolf had hit and run, he and his dragon had taken the fight to dead, and made them chase after their retreating army. Each day they'd done so, he'd taken numbers for them, and what had started out as a force twice and maybe even 3 times what they could call on was now far more equal. Yet it still wasn't time for them to truly engage, as the White Wolf had one last surprise up his sleeve, and what a surprise it was. Torreen was not the only man who cheered loudly when the world was lit up in green flames, the light from which showed what it was they were facing far more clearly than even seeing them close up at the wall head. "Flame," he shouted as the flames began to go out. Something that those who'd not marched with the White Wolf looked disbelievingly at, but those who had did not. "Knock," he shouted again as the arrows were lit and the bowstrings pulled back. Out of what had been green fire they came, these dead things that had no right to move. And again, those who'd not seen them before felt their courage began to waver. It was not him that gave them their resolve or steadied their shaking arms. It was the White Wolf as he and the other 2 dragons flew over them, their flames being laid down, and Torreen looked on as dead animals that had moved quicker than the dead men now moved no more. "Aim, loose," he shouted as the flaming arrows flew through the air and the sky was lit up more than it had been for moons. He looked on as now much further ahead the dragons split off from each other, their flames the only thing that showed him they had done so. Closer to him and the men, dead men burned as their flaming arrows hit home, and Torreen gave the order for the dragon glass tipped ones to be fired next. Now they could see who they were firing at. "Dragon glass," he shouted loudly, and men moved to take their arrows from their other quivers, each of them bearing a large number of both these and the ones they'd set alight. He could hear the running as the dead moved once more, the flames from the fallen catching some of them as they simply ran over them. "Knock," he shouted loudly, as the sound of arrows being put in place and men moving made the sound of the dead fade away. "Aim, loose." The arrows flew and most hit home. the dead falling, and Torrhen relieved to know they'd not get back up. He repeated the order and was not alone in doing so. The sounds of other brave men calling them out could be heard all down the line. When the flames that burned the dead went out, he ordered them to send the fire arrows again, and once they had done so, it was then back to the dragonglass ones. That catapults and trebuchets weren't idle as he and the archers loosed their arrows. Though it was balls of flaming pitch, piles of small pieces of dragonglass and large stones that they fired over their heads. In the distance, the dragons kept about their work, and it was his men and the arrows that ran out long before the dragons tired. "Shield wall!" he shouted loudly, and the night rang out with the sound of the shields being pushed together, and Torrhen smiled. Whether it was the White Wolf himself who'd come up with this idea or someone else, he knew not, but he hoped he got the chance to thank whoever it was. At the wall they had fought hand-to-hand, no cover other than the man's sword to your left or right, and even those who hadn't fall had risked it more than perhaps they should. Here now they held large shields, almost as big as a man, and they wedged them in the ground. Behind them, men bore their arms, and as the shields opened slightly and gave them a gap, they and the other men would attack. "Stakes!" he called out, and he watched them be moved into place. The large wooden stakes they carried would impale the dead on them, slowing their momentum down. With no arrows flying, the dead drew closer, and Torrhen hoped he and his men were ready, and that their strength and resolve would hold this night. "Spearmen, swordsmen," he shouted, and each moved to their positions. The spears they carried were more than twice the size of a man, and needed 2 men to wield it. They'd not even see the dead they hit, though they would certainly feel them. As for the swordsmen, to name them, that wasn't exactly speaking the truth. Some bore swords, others maces, morning stars, axes, pikes, and halberds, all of them sharing one thing in common. Dragonglass or Valyrian steel tips. "Make ready, hold firm, stand," the orders were shouted out, and his men from the Reach, West, and the Riverlands, and men from the North, all listened, and none shirked their duty. "For the dawn," he shouted loudly, and the dead began to crash against the shields. Danae, Jaxi had not told her that he was to use Rhaegar and Sandorex, and when she saw them fly over her head, she almost panicked. They'd both been sent away because they had no riders, and to see them here when they should not be had worried her greatly. It was only that Tyrion was so close to her that stopped her from taking to the sky and flying after them. His words bringing her the comfort that was needed, and she welcomed them. "Jay had us a plan, Dany, trust in that," her brother said, and Dany took a deep breath and did as he bid her. What a plan it was, too! Firstly, sending the barrels of wildfire through the air. The sand the wildfire had been poured over, making it safe enough to move and to be around, safe until a dragon let loose its flames. That was as Rhaegar and Sandorex did just that. The explosion sounded even louder in the quiet of the night, and the sky was lit up in a beautiful green that she and perhaps her dragons remembered well. It had to be dragonfire, none other would do, and were it to be her, Tyrion, or Jay himself, who did so then, they risked too much. Dragons could withstand both the explosions and the fire itself. True, if they got fully caught up in it, they'd perhaps not. Flying over it and letting loose their flames so it caught, and then taking to the sky that they could and did so. She felt her son's joy as they flew over her, and Tyrion heard their call as they roared out to Aegon and Rhaegar. They too had played their part, and in Sandorix's case, he had avenged his rider. Rhaegar, he felt, believed that his own rider would be back with him, and Dany let his own belief strengthen hers. With a look to Tyrion and a look back to see that her sons were indeed flying away from the battle into safety, she and Aegon took to the sky and readied to play their own part in the battle. They were soon joined by Jay and Rhaenys, all 3 dragons flying no more than a few feet from each other and not as high as they could. The sounds of the men cheering as they flew over their heads reaching them as Dany closed her eyes and felt Aegon's eagerness to do what needed to be done. "Dracarys," she called out, and heard Jay and Tyrion do the same. The 3 dragons each laying down their flames on the dead below them. Once they were done, she looked to Tyrion and to Jay and saw them both nod, and then each of them flew away from her. Tyrion flying to the left while Jay flew on straight and left the right to her. Sovagan Aegon, Sovagan Aegon, Sovagan Aegon, Sovagan Aegon, Sovagan Aegon, Sovagan Aegon, Saperzis. Fly Aegon, fly high, and then we bring them the fire. Her dragon didn't need to be told twice, and with a couple of flaps of her wings, Aegon took her higher, and Dany readied for what was to come. She gripped the reins tighter in her hand, felt the bow on her back, and the daggers on her hip, and then she told Aegon to dive. For Sandor and for Boas. For Aemon, she said, and she heard Elegon's loud roar as her dragon answered that she'd see them all avenged. The arrows flew her way, and yet she was ready for them. Her words not needed as Elegon answered this insult with fire. She felt rather than saw the first ice spear, and so she told Elegon to move to the left, and then watched it as it flew harmlessly by. When the second came, she felt it too, and it took her aback for a moment, even after she and Elegon had moved away from it. While her dragon let loose and her flames took hold of the dead beneath her, Daenerys closed her eyes and looked deep inside of herself. Juktot, left. Pixto, right. Locta, higher. Luragon, Ilogon. Drop down. As she spoke the words, she opened her eyes and saw the arrows fly by her. The ice spears miss, and she smiled as she reached up to touch the wound on her shoulder. Sagan Nike Elegon. Sagan Nike Sadzugagon da or be me, Elegon. Be me, and fear not, she said, and she heard her dragons trill as Elegon understood what she meant. They were linked her and the Night King. The ice arrow was a magical thing. Jay had told her this, and because it had struck her, it had left some of the Night King's magic within her. She could feel him calling out to her and willing her to come to him, and yet beneath the shouting of his call, other voices could be heard too. Voices not speaking to her but to him, voices that both she and Elegon now listened to. As the ice arrows flew and the ice spears were sent her way, no longer did she need to tell Elegon to move from them. Her dragon didn't need her words to tell her to avoid them or to be ready for when they were fired. Elegon could feel it, hear it, and she knew what to do, because Dany herself did. Dracarys, she said, as they flew over more dead, and she knew that they now flew at no true risk. Looking to the left, she could see Jax and Rhaenys both doing the same as she and Elegon were, the white dragon laying down her own flames, while further down the line, Tyrion and Lygaron did likewise. When she felt a need to fly back closer to their men, she did so, and she watched as a large group of whites moved to where Grey Worm and Bonifer were. Her anger at them daring to do so, fueling Elegon's own, and the flames when they came from her dragon were even more fierce than they had been up to then. Dracarys Elegon, she said as she protected those she cared about. She'd see no more losses today if she could help it. Where the explosion came from, she knew not. The green fire lit up the ground beneath her, and she felt her footing and grip on Elegon begin to come loose. Elegon felt it even keener than she did, and despite the dead and the danger, her dragon landed, and before she did, Dany fell from her back. The jolt to her body stunned her for a few moments, and Elegon let loose her flames as the dead closed in. Taking her daggers in hand, she waited for them. The distance between her and Elegon was too far for her to make without facing some of them dead, and she knew that she had no other choice but to fight. "Princess, you must move," Sir Bonifer said, and where he'd come from, she knew not. Dean seeing Grey Worm and some of her Unsullied coming towards her as well. She nodded, and then the dead were upon them. Grey Worm and the Unsullied formed a protective circle around her, and Bonifer stood by her side. Elegon had taken to the air to easier let loose her flames and was laying them down to form a barrier between them and the dead that came their way. They moved together, the Unsullied using their spears to keep the dead at bay, and as they neared their lines, she felt it as she closed her eyes. The air chilled as the White Walker moved forward, and then she saw them all fall. Each of her Unsullied, Grey Worm, Bonifer. She saw them fall, and when opened her eyes, they were full of determination to make sure that didn't happen. "Go! Go now!" she shouted as Grey Worm looked at her. "Do it. Your princess orders you," she said, and Grey Worm looked at her and shook his head until she moved to him and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Trust me." With a nod, he and the Unsullied moved away, and as they did, the dead stopped attacking. Daenerys then stepping forward only for Bunyever to grab her hand and pull her back. "I must," she said, and he shook his head. The knight had tears in his eyes, and she reached up to touch his face. "I'll not be harmed, Sir Bonifer. This is not my day to die." She moved away from him, and the White Walker looked at Bonifer and then at her. Dany moved closer, and as she reached him, she pulled the two daggers out, and with a quickness that she didn't know she possessed, she drove them into either side of the White Walker's neck. The sound of dead men falling and ice exploding was lost to her. Instead, it was the scream she felt in her head that came from the White Walker and from his master that she heard, and were she in another place and not still in danger, she'd have laughed loudly at that scream. "Princess, we must," Bonifer said, and she took his hand as they hurried away. Elegon landing down in front of them, but still some distance away. The arrow came, and she felt it, moving easily to dodge out of its way, and then she saw Boniface slump and fall down. He'd moved in front of her, in front of where she had just been to take the blow himself, to save her, even if it cost him his own life. "Boom, boom," she called out, her voice sounding strangled even to her. "Go, princess, go you must," he said, and she shook her head. "Go, I beg of you, go," he said, and she heard Elegon roar. Looking from him to the dead that moved towards them, and to Elegon, she knew she had no choice, and so she ran and climbed up onto her dragon's back and took to the sky. "Dracarys," she said, and the dead that moved to her were soon aflame, and then she bid Elegon take him from the ground. She'd not leave him behind, leave him to die alone. She could not do that. Not again. As Elegon flew, she bid her take them behind the lines, far back, so that she could land and see to him. Her dragon doing as she bid, and when they landed, she hurried to the man that Elegon held in her talons. "Bon, bon, please." "Bon," she called out, and heard his pained cry, Elegon placing him on the ground, and Dany quickly running to him and falling to the ground beside him. "Princess, you should not have," he coughed, the blood coming from his mouth. "You should not have risked yourself. I'll get help. A healer. A maester," she said, looking around and cursing herself for bringing him so far from where the healers were. "The time is long past," Bon said, coughing again, the blood splattering against her armor, though she cared not for that. "No, you can't, she said, her tears falling. Now as she knew the truth of the words, "I'd die at peace, princess. I'd die happy to have seen my love's daughter, and to have seen my love once more. I go to your mother, and I do so with tales to tell. Tales of a daughter who is all she could have ever wished her to be," he said, as the blood flowed from his mouth now. "Dainty, to you I wish to be known only as Dainty," she said, and he smiled at her, despite his pain. "Deanie," he said as his eyes closed and he breathed his last. She leaned down to place a kiss on his cheek, and then rose to her feet. Climbing up onto Elegon's back, she knew what she needed to do. "Robracarys," she said, and the flames covered Sarah Bonifer's body. Dany making sure he was at peace, and knowing that her mother's body had also been given to the fire. Then she and the dragon flew back to the fight, and as the voices once again filled her head, she swore she'd see all of them quietened before this day was done. The Great Jon. They had burned them with wildfire, with dragon fire, with flaming arrows, and with balls of burning pitch, and still they came. The shield wall held and the spears moved. The stakes impaled some and held others at bay. The axe he used hit home, and still they came. In the distance, he could see the dragons go about their deadly work, while alongside him men of the North and men and women of the true North did their own. Had someone told him years before that he'd be standing side by side with wildlings and naming them not only as allies but friends, he'd have punched them in the face for daring to speak such words to him. Now, as he looked to Mace, Tormund, to Benjen and Val, he'd punch any who named them otherwise. A little bit away from him, Rickard Karstark fought fiercely, the axe he wore on his shoulder not being used, for now instead it was the spear he thrust forward that he used to kill things that were already dead. Somewhere down the line, his son, Ned's lad, and Brandon's boy, all fought alongside other sons of the North, and were he not needed here, it would be there he went. To see his son do as he had always done, and make him proud would be something he most welcomed. Though it would have to be tales of it he drank to later, he thought, with a chuckle. His great sword was on his own back, and it was a large double-sided axe he wielded now, the dragonglass edges catching dead men and cutting into them like the bags of meat that they truly were. By the gods, I could do with a fucking ale. Tormund called out loudly to laughs. They were few and far between this morn, and it was most welcomed, even given what they were doing. "Aye, with some ice," he called out to louder laughs. "A warm pie. Some good elk." "Fuck that. Give me a woman," a voice said loudest of all, and the laughs rang out more fully. He thanked the old gods for it, welcomed it greatly, as it took his mind and other minds off the fact that they'd been facing dead men for what felt like days, and yet was only an hour or so. The Great Jon had fought in a war, he'd been in battle, and none of that prepared you for this. Courage faltered, men weakened, eventually, lines broke, and men ran, or the line you attacked proved too strong, and you retreated. The dead did not. They just came and came again, never-ending and giving no respite. It was tiring work, thirsty work, and he may have felt he could fight for days on end, but he knew this fight would prove him wrong. Swinging his axe through the gap between two shields, he felt the crack of the dead thing's skull, the white, the living dead. This abomination who sought an end to those he cared about. Each of them he took down was one less that could harm those he loved, and knowing he stood between them and these things, that he hoped would give him courage and strength enough to fight. "The king! The king!" He heard the cheer go up. The great Jon looking to the sky to see the dragon and to find it was nowhere in sight, and so shaking his head, thinking the men were just calling out for him. The king was about his own business. They should concentrate on theirs, and he was just about to shout out and tell them so. When he heard other voices, "Yea," Tormund called out, "Are you to fight by our side, my king?" Fanfiction asked. "Your dragon, she's unhurt?" Val asked worriedly, and the great Jon turned to see that the king was indeed there, thankfully unharmed and seeming no worse for wear. "Rosier is resting, as are the other dragons. It's time for you all to do the same. When I call, you close your eyes." Jack said, and he and the others looked on as Jay knelt down and unwrapped the cloth that covered the crown on his head and unsheathed his shining sword. He saw the blood flow down the blade, the light of it, and the crown shining brightly, and then he heard the king call out, and he and others did as they were bid. "Close your eyes," Jay shouted loudly. What happened, he knew not, but he felt the men in front of him relax and the pressure on the shield wall begin to diminish. "You can open them now," Jane said, and he and the others looked from the king to the light that shone not from his sword, but from a few feet in front of them. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. The wall of light stretched as far as the eye could see, and ran from west to east and down the full length of their line, he'd wager. It stood maybe 10 feet tall. And though you could look at it and through it, something seemed off about it to him. Well, more off than the fact, there was a wall of light separating them from the dead that stood on the other side. It took him a moment to see it, to realize what it was and how he did. He knew not. The light shone far more brightly where the dead stood, so much so that he would swear that, were they the other side of it and looked upon it, then they'd lose their eyes. "Jay," man said as the king stumbled when he put his sword back in its scabbard. He, Fanfiction, and others moving to him. I'm well. Magic takes a toll," Jane said, rising, and though he was unsteady on his feet, he was at least on his feet. "It'll not hold more than a few hours. I'll know when it's to fall, and so I bid you all eat, rest, and then make ready to move. We retreat behind the wind wheels and make ready for the next attack." He watched as Sarah Arthur and Sarah Jarvis helped the king away from them, laughing to himself as he'd never even noticed the two Kingsguard's presence. "Have you ever seen anything like that afore?" Tormund asked as he came and stood beside him. "I've never even heard of anything like that," he said, looking away from the king and the Kingsguard and back to the wall of light. "He's touched by the old gods themselves." Tormund said with a smile, and the great Jon couldn't agree more. Only someone who held their favor would be able to do what Jay had done, and not just today either. "Come, my friend. I think we may get that ale after all," he said, slapping the other man on the shoulder. Tormund nodding as they both moved away from what had been the front and headed back to the camp. Yohurus, he had felt it as they marched through the north, and now here in the Riverlands. The power that he had inside him was growing stronger. And each time he used that power, it almost felt as if he unlocked even more of it. At the wall, as he fought against the White Walkers and lured them into attacking him. At the grave sites of the northern dead, even more so. As the magic inside him called out to be set free. It had offered him a solution to a problem he'd not given much thought to. What to do with those already dead and buried, and it had only truly struck him then. Why the free folk and the Night's Watch burned their dead. There were no bodies at the wall for the Night King to raise, no living people between his army and Jane's own for him to turn. But there were dead buried in the ground all through the north, at keeps, and in their grounds, outside of villages, in the barrows of the first men, and in Winterfell's crypts. Perhaps it was that most of all that had led to the discovery and helped him to tap into more of the magic he possessed. The thoughts of that monster raising his mother and the rest of his kin were almost enough to make him lose his mind, as were the thoughts of burning her body and that of the other Starks that rested there. The crown, though, it was the crown and the knowledge that it too had been imbued with magic just as Lightbringer had when he had bathed it in the blood of an old god. He had been gifted the crown of the kings of winter. It had been left for him, and while he knew that it would play another role in the bringing of the dawn, it had always been meant to play this one too. So he had let the blood soak into it. Closed his eyes, and at grave sites, keeps, and villages that he and Roddick's passed, he'd said the words, and then done the same at Winterfell. Let the dead stay at rest. Nowhere more so than at Winterfell did he feel the old god's pleasure when he spoke those words. The peace he felt when he left the crypts and they marched south was enhanced by that and by the knowledge that he was only beginning to tap into all that he could do. As he had said his goodbyes to the north, he had heard the words in his head, words spoken to him by a woman long since past. Old Nan had not just given him one of the lealiest men that any king had been fortunate to know. To shield his back, she'd given him the best advice he'd ever been given when it came to magic. Who says you can't? You have a gift given to you by the old gods themselves. You think they put limits on their gifts, Jon Snow? The words she had spoken were true, and who was he to doubt them? Had he not seen just what could be done with magic? Was his goal not to do something with the power within him that would seem to be impossible? As he readied to fly with Jaime and Tyrion, as they had set out to bring the flames to the dead, he had thought of another thing Nan had said to him, and it had brought a smile to his face, which was still there, even as Rhaenys brought her fire to the dead. Do or do not, there is no try, Nad said. So after he felt Rhaegar tire, but more importantly felt through the wolves that his cousins, uncles, Jaime, Oberyn, Richard, and the others were tiring, he'd flown from where he was to where Tyrion were, and then to Dany. We go back, he had shouted, and they'd listened, though Dany at first he feared would not. When they'd landed, he'd found out why, and though he wished to comfort her, he could not. Without the dragons laying down their flames, and him doing what he must, their lines would not hold, and so he'd gone to Tyrion and begged him to comfort her in his stead. He'd then walked from where they'd landed to the nearest point, and found himself amongst the men of the north and the free folk, and had bid them listen to his word. Before he then reached inside himself and willed the magic forth. It was or would be a temporary respite, and he felt tired as he was helped away. Though he knew he had no time to rest. Looking to Arthur and to Jorah, he could see their worries, and he felt the blood fall from his nose and the ache in his head. Wiping one away and willing the other to leave him alone, he made his way to the camps, and called for Richard, Jaime, Oberyn, his uncle Ned, and others to join him. Joxers, some food and some water would be much appreciated, he said softly, and saw how he looked at him with concern. I'm well, Joxa. I'll rest for an hour or so, once I've eaten and spoken to my uncles and Jaime. Your Grace, James said with a small nod as he turned to leave and grab him some food. Yourself and Arthur too, Jors. Don't just bring me a meal, he said with a chuckle, which perhaps did more to assuage his Kingsguard's concerns than his words had. Arthur, though, not so much, and so he rose to his feet to walk to the knight, glad to find himself far steadier as he reached out to place a hand on his shoulder. I am well, Arthur. It takes less time to recover, and while my head hurts, it's not as bad as it can sometimes be. I give you my word, I speak no lie, I swear it, he said, and finally Arthur seemed to relax. Jaime arrived first and gave him the once-over, frowning when he saw the blood on his armor, but happy to see that was the only place where it was. His uncle Ned, Oberyn, Ser Richard, Garland, Mance, and Torrhen Snow all soon arrived, and by the time Lorciar and Melisandre and Jaqen did as well, he was glad that this tent was so large. The wall of light will hold for a few hours. We need to rest up, eat, and then move behind the wind wheels, he said to no replies, which he welcomed. The scorpions need to be attached and made ready to be fired, and horses placed by each of the wind wheels to allow those who man them quickly retreat. We form the next shield wall further back, and there we make ready for the attack, he said, looking to each of them. The wall, your grace. How? Melisandre asked, and he knew she wished it was Richard's will that had seen it done, and he had no surety. It was not, though he held it was the old gods, and perhaps Richard had only played his part. Magic, my lady, the song is being sung, he said, and the smile she gave him was beaming. You are well, your grace, his uncle Ned asked, and he nodded, seeing the relieved looks on the faces of those in the tent. I am. I'd speak more to you all, and I know we'd all most enjoy the chance to take a breath. We can, and must rest, and eat, and then we must move, and so I bid you all to see to your men, and to take your chance to do both. He said to Nods, my lady, if you could stay for a moment, he said, and she nodded, looking to him. He waited until the others had left, and then looked at her. Melisandre seeming to know what he was to say before he said it. The time has come, your grace. My men and I stand ready, she said with a soft smile on her face, and he rose to his feet and moved to her. I had hoped it would not, he said softly, and she smiled at him. This one far a sadder one. My God's will be done, she said as she moved to leave the tent. Melisandre, he called out, and she stopped to look at him. It's been my honor, he said, his voice cracking. No, my prince, it's been mine.